Let's go ahead and set this up. Okay, thank you very much and welcome everybody, and thank you for keeping me company this afternoon. I'm going to share my screen, and you'll probably realize that you're going to need to follow the screen somewhat if you're going to make sense of what I'm saying. Okay. So, let me hope this works out. There we go. Oh, right. Oops, this is right.
It's sharing, you're good.
Yeah, the trouble is it's not sharing the right bit.
Yeah, just go back until you get on the opening slide.
Here we go. Yeah, right, that's the beginning. You might as well start off with the title. And the title of this paper is The First Gospel in Arabic, the Islamic context of it. And I've just recently given it a subtitle to make it a little bit clearer what we're talking about, and that is the Gospels in Vatican Arabic Manuscript 13 and the Arabic translation designated H. So we'll start off by explaining what I mean by those two terms. So the translation of Matthew with parts of Mark and Luke, which is found in the manuscript Vatican Arabic 13, is reckoned by many to be the earliest extant Bible translation in the Arabic language. In Hikmat Kashu's compendious catalogue of early Arabic gospel translations, he devotes considerable space to this manuscript and to the translation it contains. And for paleographical reasons, he dates the manuscript itself to around 800 AD. However, for reasons that are mainly to do with vocabulary, he suggests that the original translation into Arabic, of which Vatican Arabic 13 is a later copy, was made in the early 7th century, or even in the 6th century, which would make it contemporary with or before the rise of Islam. Now, following Hikmat Kashu's classification, we will refer to this original translation as H. He divides the gospel translations into families, given the letters of the alphabet. In addition to the uncertainty about the date of H, there are also many questions about where it was translated and for whom. The other early Arabic translations originated in the monasteries of southern Palestine, beginning from the end of the 7th century. But the paleographic evidence that Kashu adduces points to an origin either in the Hejaz or at El Hira in Iraq. In fact, a southern Iraqi location is suggested by the use in the translation of some Persian vocabulary, particularly associated with the Arabic of that area. Moreover, there is evidence that the translator of H had difficulty understanding certain features of the Greco-Roman culture which occur in the Gospels. This is shown by the way that he deals with certain cultural terms, such as centurion, legion, stadia, which would be odd if he was working in a Christian Palestinian setting. Although it can be shown definitively that H was translated from a Syriac version, this does not indicate anything about its place of translation. However, it is interesting to note that H does not consistently follow the Syriac Peshitta text. In some places, it follows the Old Syriac versions, the Sinaitic palimpsest and or the Curetonian. So it would seem likely that the translator was working from a precursor of the Peshitta that contained many Old Syriac readings. So in view of these uncertainties about the date, location, and purpose of the Arabic translation called H, I will discuss several instances where there is evidence of Islamic context for it. Hopefully, this will serve to establish something of its period and location. And some of these instances of apparent Islamic context may in fact be insertions by copyists through whose hands the original translation, H, became the extant copy we have, Vatican Arabic 13. In the 8th century AD, these copyists would have been living in a society where Islam was increasingly influential. But there are also examples which would seem to point to an Islamic milieu for the original translator, and to show him occasionally reacting to this milieu. Some of these reactions are quite startling as part of a gospel translation, but this may also tell us something about the translator's aims and situation. The approach taken in this paper is based on a comparison of the text of Matthew in Vatican Arabic 13 with the Peshitta and Old Syriac versions and with the Byzantine Greek, resulting in a verse-by-verse analysis of the whole gospel. The eminent scholar of the Arabic Bible, Sidney Griffiths, accepts Cashu's conclusion that the original, of which the Vatican Arabic 13 Gospels are a copy, that is to say H, was translated from the Syriac. But he asserts against Cashew that it must have been produced in one of the monasteries of Syria and Palestine, where, to quote him, the other earliest Gospel translations into Arabic were made. He also rejects, even more strongly and convincingly, Cashew's conjecture that H could be dated to the period prior to or contemporary with the advent of Islam. In this matter of dating H relative to Islam, the present paper supports Griffiths' view. Now, Ronnie Volant of the Biblia Arabica project agrees with Griffiths' view on the Syriac origin, the dating, and the location of the translation of H. He then goes on, in relation to another Arabic Gospel translation, to speculate that the first Arabic Bible translations in Syria-Palestine developed from the liturgical custom of interpreting the Greek or Syriac scriptures into the previous local vernacular, namely Christian Palestinian Aramaic. He says, when a similar custom seems to have been introduced soon after the adoption of Arabic, translators rendered the weekly gospel portions to the congregation in this new vernacular. Thus, we can see the origin of H, whatever its location, as an early attempt to transcribe an extemporary oral translation. So now we will look at some places where we can find influences which seem to come from Islamic terminology and style in Vatican Arabic 13. In searching Vatican Arabic 13's version of Matthew for any signs of an Islamic context, one notices a number of places where there are wordings, terminology, or styles that seem to come not from a purely Arabic background or from a Syriac Christian heritage, but from an Islamic milieu. The most striking of these are the references to God in Matthew 15:4 and 22:32, which use an honorific epithet, a salawat, namely in the form of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, God may he be praised and exalted. This would be perfectly unremarkable in Muslim literature of the period, but it looks strange in Christian writing, and especially in a biblical translation. There is nothing in the Syriac text to justify its insertion in these places. As a technique in Bible translation, it looks more typical of the modern Muslim idiom versions that have been developed since the 1980s using Quranic language styles and nomenclature, for instance, rhyming prose, and names such as Isa and Yahya. However, there is at least one other early Arabic translation, which Cashew designates as F, that also employs some of these techniques, including occasional honorific epithets. But like most translation techniques that can be noted in Vatican Arabic 13, this usage of honorific epithets is by no means applied consistently throughout. The two instances mentioned are the only places in Matthew where honorific epithets are used. It seems likely, therefore, that this is not a feature that should be attributed to the original H translation. It may have been added during the transmission of the manuscript by a copyist who, living in the increasingly Islamic society of the 8th century, had unconsciously adopted such pious epithets into his dialect of Arabic. So all we can say for certain from this particular feature is that there was definitely some interaction between Islamic literature and the copyists or users of the H translation between its composition and its final copying as Vatican Arabic 13 around 800 AD. Another isolated instance where Vatican Arabic 13 seems to have been influenced by Islamic terminology is a reference in Matthew 12:4 to the house of God as the mihrab of God, mihrab Allah. The Syriac has Bait Allah, of which the obvious and cognate translation would be Bait Allah, the house of God, which Vatican Arabic 13 does have elsewhere. Now, although mihrab most commonly means the niche in a mosque that indicates the Qibla, the direction for prayer, it appears to have originally meant the upper or most honored end of a tent or sitting room, and it also referred to places of worship. In the Quran, chapter 19, Surah Maryam, verse 11, mihrab refers to the place that Zechariah emerges from after seeing the angel, which in biblical terms would be the temple or house of God. So it might therefore be claimed that the use of mihrab Allah in Vatican Arabic 13 is an echo of the Quran. Now, a clearer echo of the Quran occurs in Matthew 24:29, which is an apocalyptic passage where the Syriac text has Shemsha Nehsaq, the sun is darkened, but Vatican Arabic 13 has Tazullam Ashamish wa Tatakawwar, the sun becomes dark and is wrapped around. Now, the use of hendiadys, or double translation, as in becomes dark and is wrapped around, appears to have been a favorite technique of the translator of H, and is certainly very common in the manuscript. But the phrase Ashamash Tatakawwar is highly reminiscent of Quran chapter 81, Atakwir, which is in a similarly apocalyptic passage. Iza Ashamish Kuwirat, when the sun is wrapped around. However, this instance of double translation differs from the vast majority of other examples of double translation in Vatican Arabic 13, which simply consist of the addition of a synonym, for instance in Matthew 8:16, where he healed becomes Shafa wa Abra, he healed and cured. Occasionally, the second term is an explanation of a more difficult or technical first term. For instance, in Matthew 20:19, and they lift him up in the Syriac, becomes وَيَصْلِبُونَهُ وَيَقْتُلُونَهُ, and they crucify him and kill him. But in the verse we're looking at, Matthew 24:29, the sun becomes dark and is wrapped around, consists of the addition of a metaphor to a simple term, which makes it more likely that it's added simply for the sake of echoing the known Quranic phraseology. Now, at least this addition of a Quranic echo in 24:29 preserves the meaning of the source text that H was presumably translated from. However, in Matthew 13:42 and 50, we have a clear echo of the Quran which actually alters the meaning from that of the source text. These verses refer to the evil people being cast, in the Syriac, Baltuna Dunura, into a furnace of fire. But Vatican Arabic 13 has them being cast fi ukhdud min nar, into a trench of fire. Now, the term ukhdud cannot mean a furnace. So the only possible reason for using it here must be as an echo of Quran chapter 85, Surat al-Buruj, verses 4-5, which refer to the trench, the fire supplied with fuel, into which people were cast. Now, ironically, the Quranic verse is referring to a fire into which the believers, not the evildoers, were cast by their enemies. But this was clearly not important as far as the translator of H was concerned. Now, by most norms of biblical translation, this unnecessary substitution of a completely different concept, trench for furnace, would be considered illegitimate. The fact that there are many other such instances of illegitimate translation in H, quite apart from the copyist insertions which appear in Vatican Arabic 13, raises questions again about who the original translator was, in what milieu he did his translation, and for whom. If, like all the other extant early Arabic biblical translation, H was translated in the monasteries of southern Palestine, what monastic translator would have ventured to make these alterations to the text? And who would have preserved such a translation? Perhaps this would be evidence, as Kashu suggests, that H comes from a missionary situation, possibly Al-Hira in Mesopotamia or Najran in Yemen. So we will move on now to looking at some instances where there seems to be some teaching for Christians evident in this translation, in the context, specifically in the context of Islam. In addition to these places in Vatican Arabic 13's version of Matthew, where there are Islamic lexical influences noticeable, there are also a number of places where it seems as if the original translator or later copyists wanted to explain or apply the gospel narrative for their audience in the context of interactions with Islam. This led them to add material or alter Matthew's text. One of the most obvious places where the copyists have added this in the course of transmission is in the first part of Matthew 17:24, where the Syriac Peshitta has the following text. And when they came to, this is a fairly literal word-for-word translation of the Peshitta here. And when they came to Capernaum, there approached those who took the two drachmas of the poll tax to Cephas. And incidentally, it's always Cephas, not Peter, in Syriac and in Vatican Arabic 13. However, Vatican Arabic 13 has, and the translation of which is given there, and when they came to Capernaum, there approached those who used to take the 2 drachmas of the jizya, and that was not for the jizya, but for the something of the house of God, to Cephas. And the something is a word that is unrecognizable in the Arabic. Now, the explanation of the term jizya here interrupts the grammar of the Arabic sentence so badly that it's clearly something originally added in the margin of the text and subsequently incorporated into the line of the text by a later copyist. But the point of interest is why anyone should have thought an explanation of jizya was necessary. Although the term primarily designates the tax paid by non-Muslim subjects to a Muslim government, it does also occur with reference to other taxes. At Matthew 22:17, Vatican Arabic has it, without comment, for the tax paid to Caesar, as do modern Arabic translations. Yet someone, presumably in the early transmission of H, thought that his readers needed to know that Jesus was not subject to the jizya, the one that they paid to their Muslim readers, Muslim rulers. An instance of the meaning of the source text being altered in order to apply it to the contemporary audience of the translation is seen in Matthew 17:17, where Jesus rebukes his followers. The Syriac Peshitta has Jesus calling them a generation that is not believing, and the old Syriac versions gives the same meaning. But Vatican Arabic 13 has the generation that leaves the faith, which is different. Presumably the translator or a copyist saw that the problem of Christians in his day was not that they lacked faith in Christ, but that they were abandoning the Christian faith under pressure from Islam. Needless to say, the altering of the biblical text, even for reasons of pastoral concern, has never been a normal technique of Bible translation. But here again, it raises questions about what sort of translation H really was, who it was for, and how it was expected to be used. Could it have been intended and used for the instruction of Arabophone Christians who could not benefit when the authoritative Syriac version was read in the liturgy in church? This might also be the reason for an expanded translation in Matthew chapter 22, verse 16. In this verse, the Pharisees and the Herodians are flattering Jesus and saying, "We know that you are trustworthy and that you teach the word of God truthfully." And that is a reading of both the Syriac and the Greek texts. But in Vatican Arabic 13, it becomes, "We know that you are trustworthy in what you have come to do, and that you teach people to follow the way of God and to act in obedience to it rightly and truly." Besides the explanatory additions here, it's noticeable that this uses the Islamic phrase "Sabil Allah," the way of God, thus making a counterclaim as to the real source of religious truth. Now, if H was translated sometime in the late 7th to early 8th centuries, when Islam was beginning to exert serious pressure on Christian communities, it would also explain several instances where the translation has added, omitted, or altered material from its Syriac source to enhance the dignity of Jesus in the gospel narrative. Although not that it does this consistently. Like all idiosyncratic features of Vatican Arabic 13, these features only appear sporadically. The most obvious example of an addition that enhances the dignity of Jesus also shows the serendipitous placement of these features in Vatican Arabic 13. Matthew 20:29 is simply a transitional statement giving the setting for the incident of the healing of the two blind men. In accordance with the Syriac, Vatican Arabic 13 states that Jesus was leaving Jericho and was joined by a large crowd. But then it adds the phrase, ajlalan lahu wa tawaqqura, an honor and a mark of respect for him. It's not at all clear why the translator or some copyist thought that the large crowd added to Jesus' dignity at this point, since no comment is made on any of the numerous other mentions of large crowd following him. Nevertheless, it indicates a concern for Jesus' status, and thus shows that this status was under threat at the time it was inserted into the translation. Another place where this concern for the dignity of Jesus occurs is in Matthew 16, 22 to 23. In this passage, Jesus is rebuking Peter for trying to dissuade him from his path to self-sacrifice in Jerusalem. After saying that Peter is Satan and an obstacle to him, Jesus states that Peter's ideas come from human thinking, not from God. But then Vatican Arabic 13 has an added explanation. Because the one who came, it was determined that he suffer. He is life for the believers. Again, the awkward sentence grammar of the Arabic here may indicate that this comment was added by a copyist rather than the original translator of H. Yet it does seem that someone wanted to make it very clear to their audience that, contrary to the teaching of Islam, Jesus' sufferings were preordained. Then, the same hand, or perhaps another, added a statement that the purpose of the sufferings was eternal life for those who believe in Jesus. This also seems to be an attempt to show that the crucifixion was not something undignified to be resiled from, but rather a benefaction to be celebrated. Unwillingness to depict Jesus as subject to undignified suffering may also explain the way Jesus is shown praying and then being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. Between Matthew 26, 44 and 45, Vatican Arabic 13 has inserted material from the parallel passage in Luke, which includes the clause, as the Syriac Peshitta reads, and when he was in fear. However, Vatican Arabic 13 gives this as وَإِذْ هُوَ هَاتِفٌ, and when he was calling out. There is no particular reason here to view this as a copyist emendation. It may be that the translator of H just did not want Jesus to be seen as weak and fearful. So he did what translators are sometimes tempted to do. He altered the text to make it say what he thought it ought to have said. Then a little further on in the same passage, we have the incident where Judas Iscariot approaches Jesus and greets him with a kiss, indicating to the soldiers that this is the man that they should arrest. Jesus then speaks to Judas, Matthew 26:50. And again, Vatican Arabic 13 has material inserted from Luke. In the Syriac, this is Judas, with a kiss are you betraying the Son of Man? But the version given in Vatican Arabic 13 is a subtle variation on this. Judas, is it with kisses that the Son of Man is betrayed? Now, this turning of the active verb into a passive does not materially change the meaning, but it does take the focus off Judas. And it thus avoids the implication that Judas is in control of the situation and that Jesus is at Judas's mercy. Then, in the same vein, later in the same verse, when the soldiers actually arrest Jesus, Vatican Arabic 13, has they stretched out their hands towards Jesus, which is somewhat more dignified than the original Syriac. They laid hands on Jesus. So there does seem to be a clear attempt in this translation to uphold, if not embellish, the honor and status of Jesus, presumably because it was considered to be under threat from Islamic teaching. However, in Vatican Arabic 13, the most blatant example of maintaining a Christian view of Jesus in the face of Islam is not an alteration to the text or an addition, but an omission. In the Palm Sunday narrative of Matthew 21, when Jesus is entering Jerusalem, the crowds who are welcoming him are asked by others who he is. And in Matthew 21:11, sorry, whoops, we seem to be going backwards instead of forwards. Let's try this. Here we go. In Matthew 21:11, they answer, "It is Jesus, the prophet." But Vatican Arabic 13 has, "This is Jesus." The failure to describe Jesus as a prophet must surely be significant, since the accidental omission of terms is not a feature of this manuscript. Although the New Testament occasionally does use the term prophet for one aspect of Jesus' ministry, its use by Muslims as a standard title or epithet for him, the prophet Jesus, has always sounded demeaning in Christian ears. For that reason, the translator of H may have been unwilling to put such a usage into the mouths of Jesus' supporters in the gospel. Excuse me a minute. So we now come on to another aspect. In addition to the above examples where Vatican Arabic 13 seems to support Christian sensitivities in the face of the encroaching power of Islam, it also has a few interesting readings in which it appears to defer to Muslim attitudes. However, it would be going too far to say that the translation was aimed at a Muslim audience, especially since it also seems to contain some anti-Islamic polemic, as we will see in a minute. Now, in view of the present-day controversies in the Bible translation world, it's interesting to see how the translator of H, or the later copyist, handled in a Muslim context what are called the divine familial terms, that is to say, references to Jesus as the Son of God and to God as his Father. Since such references cause deep offense to many Muslims, some translations use periphrases rather than translating them literally. But in fact, almost all references to the Son of God, and by Jesus to my Father, meaning God, are translated in Vatican Arabic 13 perfectly literally. However, twice in Matthew, where the conditional clause, "if you are the Son of God," occurs, in chapter 4, verse 6 and 27:40, Vatican Arabic 13 has, "if you are a son for God," or a son of God. This is despite the fact that in almost adjacent verses, Matthew 4:3 and 27:43, the literal translation is used, "if you are the Son of God." It would appear, therefore, that at some point a copyist took account of the sensitivity of this term. The only other place in Matthew where Vatican Arabic 13 may show awareness of this problem is at 26:29, where Jesus refers to the kingdom of my Father. Here, Vatican Arabic 13 has Malakut Allah, the kingdom of God. This may be a case of interference from the parallel passages in Mark and Luke, where the Syriac does have kingdom of God. But although interference from other passages does occur in that Vatican Arabic 13, it is not usually at the level of a single word like this. So it may be that a copyist is here trying to avoid an offensive term. Perhaps one could call it a euphemism. And at Matthew 18:10, it's noticeable the Vatican Arabic does not avoid a reference to Jesus, by Jesus to God as my Father, yet it does seem to be trying to avoid a different sort of offense to Muslims, an anthropomorphic reference to God. The Syriac refers to the angels seeing the face of my Father. But Vatican Arabic 13 has Wuquf amam abi, standing before my Father. In view of the abhorrence of Islamic teaching for tashbih, which is adducing similarity between God and a created being, this looks very much like an attempt to accommodate Muslim sensibilities. However, it could also be that on this point, the translator himself was subject to similar scruples for reasons of his Christology. So now we will come on to instances showing some polemic against Islam. Despite the previous references where Vatican Arabic 13 seems to display an arenical attitude to Islam, it also contains examples of what might be regarded as polemical translation. Obviously, these are not direct, overt attacks on Islam or on Islamic teachings, but in several cases, allusions are introduced which are not at all difficult to decode. Perhaps the most flimsily disguised attempt at a rebuttal of Islam occurs at Matthew 13:57. In view of the omission of reference to Jesus as a prophet in 21:11 that we've mentioned, it is interesting that in this verse, such an ascription of Jesus as a prophet is not so much avoided as turned against the prophet of Islam. When Jesus is rebuking the people of his hometown for their casual rejection of his ministry, he quotes what is generally taken to be this proverb: "There is not a prophet who is despised except in his town and in his house." But Vatican Arabic 13 renders this as, "There is not a prophet worthless, despicable, except the prophet who prophesies in his town and in his residence and in his family." Here, the whole utterance has been changed from a statement about how all prophets are treated to a value judgment on one particular type of prophet. This makes it look much more like the work of the original translator of H than the result of an accidental or deliberate emendation by a copyist. It seems as if the translator knew of a particular prophet who had uttered many of his prophecies in his home and in his hometown, and that the translator thought that Jesus' words must apply to that situation. In another passage, the translator of H seems to have spotted an opportunity to attack the teachings of Islam. Matthew 15:1-9 relates an incident in which Jesus rebukes the Pharisees and scribes for their teaching. But in 3 places, the translator has changed or embellished the terms used, apparently to make the rebukes more relevant to his day and age. In Matthew 15:3, verse 3 and 6, the Peshitta term, Mashal Manuthkun, your tradition, is translated as the sham commandments that are in your hands. And then at Matthew 15:9, the Syriac phrase, their teachings which are human commands, becomes in Vatican Arabic 13, their false teachings and commandments. In the parallel passage to this in Mark, your tradition is rendered using the terms bid'ah, innovations or heresies, and rawaya kadhiba, false stories. It seems that the translator felt that the main fault of Jesus' opponents must have been the same as the main fault which he saw in his contemporary opponents of Christianity. That is to say, not the Pharisees prioritizing human tradition over divine commands, but the Islamic propagation of laws and commands that were novel, false, and heretical. However, there is one place in Vatican Arabic 13 where its reading may either be a very pointed jibe at Islam or simply an infelicitous ambiguity. At Matthew 27:3, after the arrest of Jesus, Judas Iscariot is described as Yehuda Mashlamana in the Syriac, Judas the betrayer. Vatican Arabic 13 has a literal translation of this, Yehuda al-Muslim. Now, in the 8th century, the word al-Muslim could be read with either the sense, the betrayer, or with the sense, the Muslim. And to open up the possibility that the arch villain of the gospel narrative was a Muslim must have been an opportunity for invective that the translator, or possibly a later copyist, simply couldn't pass over. So, to come to our conclusions. Apart from the examples that I have mentioned, there are no other significant wordings or passages in Vatican Arabic 13's version of Matthew that might betray an Islamic context. The translation contains many peculiarities, but these do not relate to the religious milieu in which it originated. So there are two conclusions that can safely be drawn. One, the translation in its current form clearly dates from the Islamic era. And there are several examples indicate that the original version, H, was also produced after the appearance of Islam in the early 7th century. Although there has been speculation that H might possibly date from before Islam, proof of such a dating would require explaining away the examples that have been adduced here and would have to reconstruct the text without the Quranic and Islamic references. And two, despite its Islamic context, H was not translated with a Muslim audience in mind. The Islamic references and adaptations are much too few and far between for this to have been the case, and the occasional polemics make it impossible. Instead, it's clear that the translation was made for Arabic-speaking Christians living in the context of an ascendant Islam. If it dates from the later 7th or early 8th centuries, as I've suggested, these may have been native speakers of Arabic from the Arabic churches which existed from the 6th century onwards, that's to say from before Islam. Or they may have been non-Arabs from the previously Aramaic-speaking churches of the area who were adopting Arabic as their spoken language under continued Arabic rule. The fact that H was translated from Syriac, not Greek, suggests a Jacobite or Nestorian setting. It has been suggested that H may have been an informal translation resulting from oral interpretations that followed readings from the Syriac Bible. Readings from the Syriac Bible in the church liturgy. That might explain some of the idiosyncrasies and the sporadic insertion of elements of commentary by the translator, which seems to have led some of its later copyists to also add their own contributions. That's the end of the paper. Thank you very much. And just a few bibliographical items there for anyone who is interested. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you, Andrew, and for your lecture. And again, per usual, if you're interested in asking a question of Andrew, at the bottom of your screen, there is a button that says reactions, and you click on that, and then you push the raise hand, and then I can see your hand from all those are gathered. Let me begin. Let's go with David Singh. David, you go first. Go ahead and unmute.
Yes, thank you very much for this excellent work. Obviously, a lot of work has gone into this research, and this is, from my point of view, really, really fascinating. I'm just wondering if in your reading of the early versions of the Arabic Bible, you came across early Christians who were probably reading the same version. I'm not very sure if they were reading the same version, or there were several different versions of the Arabic Bible way back in the late 8th century or in the early part of the 9th century. People like Ammar al-Basri and Abu Ra'ita, who were obviously writing a lot for Christians, but writing for Christians in the Islamic context. So they have a lot to say about God. They have a lot to say about Jesus Christ and so on, obviously with an intent to make sure that these Christians do not leave Christianity and become Christians. So I'm just wondering if you're aware of how some of these early Arab Christians writers were reading the same versions that you are reading now after so many.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm not sure whether I can answer your question specifically, but it does open up a point which I think needs to be made, and which there wasn't space to make in the paper. First of all, it's one of those little-known facts of trivia that there are more translations of the Bible, or more different separate biblical translations in Arabic than there are in any other language of the world. In fact, there are thousands of them. The reason that we haven't heard about them is that most of them exist only in one manuscript, and most of those manuscripts are in archives and libraries in the Middle East and scattered around Europe and the rest of the world. And hardly any of them have actually been investigated. And it's only in the last 10 or 15 years, particularly under the Biblia Arabica project, that concentrated effort has been made to actually study the field of the early Arabic biblical translation manuscripts. Hardly any of them have been published. So the fact is, this particular manuscript, which I've been studying, only this particular translation that occurs in Vatican Arabic 13 does not occur in any other manuscript that is extant. There is only the one copy of it. There are a lot of other manuscripts around which seem to have copied one another and interacted with one another on different translations. This one seems to be very early and, as I said, idiosyncratic. It was never picked up and reused, retranslated, adapted, and so on. Others became more popular. But what seems to have happened in the Arab Christian world of the early centuries after Islam was that the Bible remained in the canonical languages of Greek or Syriac for church use. For individual use, there were people, if they wanted a translation in Arabic, they would get someone to make one. And they seem to have been made in places all over the Arabic world for individual use. But some of those became fairly popular and were copied several times and spread around. Others just remained as one copy. And of course, I'm sure there were thousands more that remained as one copy and have been destroyed and lost over 1,000 years. So there are, so the nearest I can get to an answer to your question is that your Arabic writers that you're talking about will not have been using this particular translation. Yeah. It will depend on what church background they came from, whether they used a translation that was done from the Syriac or from the Greek. If they were from the Nestorian or Jacobite churches, they would have used an Arabic translation done like this one from the Syriac. if they were from the Chalcedonian churches, they would have used one done from the Greek.
Yeah.
And some of these, the Greek ones tend to be much more literal. The Syriac ones tend to employ some of the techniques that I've illustrated here, but probably in most translations done from the Syriac, not as many different techniques all in one place.
Am I allowed to ask another question, Tom?
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Okay, the word rab, is this word rab or Lord, is this word used in the translation you were reading? Or if it is used there, is it used with the definite article al or without, as in the Quran? Because in the Quran, al is never used with the word rab.
Now you've got me stumped. The word rub is definitely used in the translation, and I suspect it is used with a definite article.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, the actual Quranic echoes appear to be quite specific in specific odd places in this particular translation, which does prove the point that it must have been produced after the Quran was available, but show that it was not attempting to actually imitate the Quran, as in fact the other one I mentioned, the ones of the family F, what are known as the elegant Gospels, do appear to be making some effort to actually imitate Quranic style in many ways, and quite possibly were done for a Muslim audience or even by a Muslim.
Thank you.
Good. Let me ask a layman's question, but when you're looking at the text, Andrew, how was it that how do you go about dating this text? What are you looking at in order to place it in history? What sort of things are you looking for in terms of setting the time of when this was written?
Okay. Yeah, well, that is a little bit beyond my expertise, and I'm reliant on other sources for that. As I've mentioned, this whole field of the early Arabic Bible translations, which are almost entirely in manuscript form still, have only recently begun to be studied in detail. So I'm reliant on what other people have said. I think I mentioned at the beginning the work by Hikmat Kashu of Beirut, who is currently now pastor of a very large church in Beirut. And for his doctorate at Birmingham, he produced a catalogue of all the manuscripts of Arabic translation of the Gospels that he could find in several dozen libraries around the Middle East and Europe, and divided them up into family trees, which had never been done before. He particularly seemed to have taken an interest in this one, and he found evidence from the writing style of the current manuscript, which he thought indicated that it could have originated in the about the same time as Islam, in the early 7th century. Right. So he was working on script and so on. Other people, but on the other hand, there are questions of vocabulary, and I've tried to prove that it must have been after Islam because it contains references to Islam. So there are various things. This particular manuscript doesn't contain any sort of signature by the original author. Some manuscripts do and date. So there are a variety of techniques that are used for doing this, and I'm sure the field is really only in its infancy at this point. When you compare it to the study of Greek New Testament manuscripts, it's nothing. It's nothing like it.
But meanwhile, there are quite a few texts that still need to be gone through that have not been fully studied.
quite a few, Tom, is a wonderful example of British understatement, if I may say so. There are a handful of the thousands, the hundreds of extant manuscripts that have been looked at.
Oh, yeah.
Cashew has documented, loads of manuscripts, and that's just of the Gospels. And hardly anyone said anything about any of them.
Yeah.
No one has been interested until recently. And in fact, I had never heard of this field until 10 years ago, when our friend the late Keith Small happened to introduce me to it one day when I was asking him a question about, well, what was the earliest Arabic Bible?
Yeah. Where do they tend to be housed in the Middle East? Is it in Egypt or
Sorry, where do they get what?
Where are they housed? Where are their extant copies?
Well, all I can suggest is you look up my reference to Cashew and his catalogue, because he has a list of the libraries he looked in.
Okay.
But there are ones, there is particularly, there's the Coptic Patriarchate in Cairo. There are several others in Cairo. There's the Bibliotheca Orientalia in Beirut, and some others in Beirut, some at the monasteries in Syria and Lebanon, and presumably other places. And all over, there are quite a few in the Bodleian Library right in Oxford, probably that no one has ever even looked at.
Wow.
So libraries all over Europe and the Middle East, and probably one or two in the Americas as well.
Good. Further questions? Well, seeing no hands, I will then tie up. Oh, no, there's one. Regina, please go ahead.
Oh, we got two there.
Oh, two there. There's Rosemary.
Yeah. Dr. Persson, thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm just curious, the Bible translation, or the earliest manuscripts we've had up until this period of the document age, 400 or 500, 600 years of copies going around. Do you have any thoughts or any explanation as to why there was such a rapid proliferation of the Quran, that it was already beginning to influence or see evidence of it in early Christian works such as this? I'm just curious, because it seems to have, in a short span of time, from the time of Islam and the writings of Quran and the translations of the Quran, already now showing evidence of influence in that in Christian translations or Syriac translations.
Well, I think I would probably have expected it. I think what seems to have happened, one or two commentators have said this, and it seems to make sense to me, is that the Quran was actually compiled, finally put together in its final form towards the end of the 7th century under the Caliph Omar. And that seems to have given an impetus to the Arab-speaking churches that existed at that time, which probably would have still been mainly the pre-Islamic Christian churches of the area, dating from 100 or 150 years before that, when Christianity first seemed to move into the Arab world of Arabia. Those churches then were faced with the beginnings of literacy in Arabic. It's standardly agreed that the Quran was the first sort of literary work in Arabic available. And the Christian churches up to that point had simply been managing with scriptures in Syriac or Greek, and suddenly realized that they needed something in Arabic. And that seemed to have given rise to the beginning of biblical translation in Arabic from the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 8th century, which is when I'm positing that this version was made, but there are others as well around the same point. So the Arab Christians were now ruled by Arab Muslims and were aware of the pressure on them. The Quran seems to have been distributed, propagated, and so on very widely by the Muslim community, even though by the beginning of the 8th century, Muslims would not have been in a majority, even in Middle Eastern countries such as Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and so on. It came by the end of the 8th century, but not at the beginning of it. So non-Muslims would have been a majority, but the pressure would have been on. And obviously Muslims were propagating the Quran. And I suspect that's why it begins to show up in a Bible translation, and then, as David was mentioning, in Christian Arabic literature, which takes advantage of the new literacy in Arabic to start educating Christians.
Good. Rosemary, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Oh, please unmute yourself, Rosemary.
Unmute yourself. Oh, there you go.
I have that. Yes, going on from there, I'm fascinated as to what you can deduce about Christian, Islamic, or Muslim relations at that time.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, yeah, this is I've been trying to stick to what I could deduce from this one manuscript on a particular question.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
It would seem that in the early period, from what I've read and heard of other writers on this topic, and I would refer you, put a plug in here for the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies in Oxford and their lecture series and so on, which often deal with this particular topic, Christian-Muslim relations in a historical period. And it would appear that in the early centuries, relations were much more cordial than later on. Muslims would refute Christianity in their arguments, and Christians would rebut Islam in their arguments, obviously. But the heavy Islamic polemic against Christianity and rejection of anything to do with Christian theology seems, from what I've gathered, and I might have got the running into the stick, but seems to really date from much later, like the 11th century. And
Yes.
that period was when Muslim writers began to actually say, no, all Christian theology is wrong.
Yeah.
Don't quote the Bible, don't use the Bible or the Torah or the Injil as sources for any argument in Islam, because they're all wrong. That is a later position. Much earlier on, Muslims were quite open to listening to the people of the book and listening to what they had to say, and even in some cases, obviously, reading bits of the Jewish and Christian scriptures, normally in Arabic.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Rosemary. Any other questions? Well, good. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. And for those who came late, because I know there was a little bit of confusion on the time, this has been recorded and will be on our YouTube channel. If you want to find out the YouTube link to that, write to Nadine Woods, who sent out the announcement to each of you, and she will send you the link to be able to listen to this